Let me start with a very fundamental question to Ronald Suny. What happened to Armenian intellectuals and cultural leaders in 1915, and what role did that play in the unfolding plan to eradicate the Armenian population of Turkey?
Thank you, Peter. The events of 1915, which we are going to be thinking about tonight, unfolded in a series of collections of groups of people, the most dramatic of which was on the evening of April 24th, 1915. But even before the arrests of that night, already in Eastern Anatolia, what we would call historic Armenia, there was fighting, there were massacres, and there were already people being rounded up. Many people don't know that some tens of thousands of Armenian young men had been mobilized thanks to Armenian church and Armenian political parties, and became members, soldiers in uniform of the Ottoman army. And those young men fought, and some died in the early campaigns on the Eastern Front against Russia. But late February, early March 1915, the central government, the Young Turks of the Ottoman Empire, decided to demobilize these young Armenians, take away their uniforms and their weapons, and turn them into labor battalions, amele tabular in Turkish, and eventually to murder them. The ostensible reason for that was that the Young Turks had convinced themselves, or at least told themselves, that these Armenians were traitors. They were collaborating with the Russians on the other side. Indeed, there were Armenians, Russian Armenians, largely fighting on the Russian side. And after the great Battle of Sarıkamış in January and February, December and January of 1914-1915, which the Turks lost thanks to the poor generalship of Enver Pasha, the Turks decided to blame the Armenians for that defeat and took it out on these former soldiers. Cutting down these young men who were easily marked, easily segregated, and then murdered, meant that the muscle of the Armenian nation had been eliminated. Shortly after this, in the city of Van, near the border with Iran, a city, by the way, in which Armenians constituted one of the few places in the Ottoman Empire, a majority of the population, the people there, the Armenians, defended themselves against the encroaching massacres coming ever closer to the city. That event was considered by Constantinople, by Istanbul, to be an insurrection, and was the excuse for the arrest that evening of April 24th of the hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, writers, the composer Gomitas, and politicians, party leaders, indeed members of parliament, like Grigor, who had been friends with Talat Pasha, the architect of the genocide, and indeed had been playing cards with him at a European club the evening before. Those people were taken out of the city. Most of them would perish. A few, like Balakian and Gomitas, and others would survive, but most of them were destroyed. Thus, having eliminated the muscle of the Armenian nation, the Young Turks destroyed the brain of the nation, making it impossible for Armenians to organize any kind of serious defense or coordinate among the various centers. The genocide went on then. Thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children were rounded up, driven through the valleys and mountains of eastern Anatolia into the deserts of Syria, into Raqqa and Del Zor. That is, the very places where ISIS is today, which were considered uninhabitable by the Young Turks. And there, they were massacred again in the winter of 1915 and early 1916. The genocide itself can be considered a gendered genocide. First, it was the men who were eliminated, the soldiers, the intellectuals, the leaders of various communities. A whole nation's elite was taken away. And then women and children were removed, old people. Many of the women and children were then assimilated into Islamic families, either as concubines, slaves, or members of the family. So the genocide has three different prongs, three different angles to it. One is dispersion of the Armenians, so they can no longer constitute anywhere a group of more than 5%. They cannot become a nation again. Dispersion, deportation. The second was physical murder. That is the killing by the Teşkilat-i Mahsusa, the special expedition, by local Kurds, Circassians, and Chechens, under the eyes of the Ottoman and German army. And the third was this forced assimilation and Islamization, which means that today, of those hundreds of thousands of women and children who somehow survived as Muslims, there are indeed millions of people today, Turks, Kurds, and Arabs, who have Armenian ancestry, another form in which the nation has survived.